Hi, and welcome to the folks who are joining us. We've got a couple more people trickling in. So as they are getting settled, I want to thank you and good evening. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening live. We're glad to have you here tuning in to tonight's event to learn all about Central Oregon salmon and trout. My name is Rebecca Ratcliffe. I am the Outreach Associate for the Deschutes Land Trust. And I know many of you are joining us for a virtual event for the first time, and some of you have been here for some of our other virtual events and may have met me already. I'll be doing my best to facilitate our event today. As a reminder, we are asking that our presenter will be the only one with the mic on and also the only one with your video on. That'll help us all be able to see and hear our presenter clearly. So thank you for doing that in advance. We will be sharing additional tidbits about this presentation following the event. So if you missed something or have questions or would like more resources, don't fret. We'll be sending those out in an email following the event. For those of you who are not yet familiar, the Deschutes Land Trust is a conservation organization local to Bend, Oregon. We currently protect and care for over 17,000 acres of critical wildlife habitat, incredible streams, and of course, stunning natural beauty here in our area. With our usual calendar of guided walks and hikes on hold, we have transitioned to some virtual events, and this is actually going to be our final virtual live event of this season, so I'm glad you were able to join us. If you didn't make it for the former events, they are available recorded on our website, DeschutesLandTrust.org. I would say if you're enjoying our virtual content like today's talk, please do consider making a donation. Not only does it help us continue to inspire others about conservation, but it helps us to protect these important places and streams and salmon habitat that we're going to learn more about, I'm sure. I will be sure to have that donation link in the chat today. Then also in the chat, we will have a chance to talk with Megan about your questions once she's finished presenting. So if you think of something that you'd like to ask, please do put that in the chat and I'll be able to ask that to Megan in the end of our event. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Megan Hill. Megan has been studying Central Oregon fisheries since 2007. Currently working as a fisheries manager for Portland General Electric's hydroelectric project on the Deschutes. Throughout her career at PGE, Megan has had the opportunity to snorkel, conduct juvenile fish surveys, locate spawning salmon and steelhead in the Metolius River and Waichus Creek, and so many other fun things, but I will, of course, let her tell you more about them. So Megan, thank you so much for being here, and I'll just let you take it away.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, great. Just want to double check before I start talking away. So thanks for being here today. I know that it can be tough to join a Zoom call this late in the day, so I really appreciate you being here to learn about salmon and trout. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to, let's see. All right. So I was going to start with a little introduction to myself, and Rebecca already did that a bit. I am the fisheries manager with Portland General Electric, and I've been studying salmon and trout in Central Oregon for about 13 years now, and I love going out in the field for work and also for play, and most recently helping introduce my kids to Central Oregon. I have a 3-year-old and 6-year-old, and my other reason for mentioning that is that I've sequestered myself in our spare bedroom to do this talk, but they could come busting in at any point despite my best efforts. So bear with me if that happens, and I need to take a moment to pass them back to my husband. So my plan for today is to first talk about our 4 native salmon and trout species in Central Oregon, kind of give you an introduction to those. And then I'm going to talk about the recent history of kind of salmon and steelhead in Central Oregon, really focusing in on Pelton Round Butte project and reintroduction, because that's what I know best, and talking about kind of the current state of things. And then I was going to end with providing you guys some tips where, if you're interested, you can go out and see spawning kokanee, and if you're lucky, sockeye, because that was sort of the original event we had planned last year, was to get out with you all at the Land Trust property on Spring Creek and do a salmon walk. So I'm hoping to provide you the tools to do that by yourself in a COVID safe way. The other event that we were trying to get together this year was a tour with the Land Trust of our fish facilities. And so I'm going to try to provide you a little bit of a virtual version of that tonight as well. So with that, we'll start with my favorite of our species here in Central Oregon, which is Omicus. It's steelhead and red band. You'll also hear them called rainbow. Those are all the same species of fish. The difference between a steelhead and a red band is their life history. So a red band, kind of one extreme, will spend its entire life within kind of the same stream it was born in. Whereas a steelhead is the anadromous form, so it's going to go to the ocean. So typically steelhead in the Deschutes will spend 2 years in fresh water, then migrate out to the ocean for a couple years and come back as an adult to spawn. What I kind of find fascinating about steelhead and red band is those are kind of the two extremes, but there's tons of variation between those. So you might have a red band that doesn't go all the way to the ocean, but it goes to a bigger river to feed and grow. And so it makes them extremely challenging to try to reintroduce and manage, but it also makes them very interesting. And how some of that variation plays out in the Deschutes Basin is in the Metolius, which is a cold, spring-fed river with really good water quality. You predominantly see a red band population. And the thinking behind that is, a fish can live out its whole life pretty happy in the Metolius because it has good water quality year round. And so there's really no need to undergo a lengthy and risky migration out to the ocean to live throughout the summer. In contrast, if you look at a tributary like Trout Creek on the lower Deschutes, that gets really warm in the summer. Sections of it dry up or become very sparse as far as water availability. And so it does make sense for at least a portion of the population to be out in the ocean and kind of avoid those harsh summer conditions. So that's kind of an interesting way that the different streams kind of drive these different life histories. So that's steelhead. Steelhead's one of the species that we're working to reintroduce above the Pelton Round Butte project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that portion later. The next species of salmon and trout I want to highlight are bull trout. Bull trout are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, but they're doing really well here in the Metolius Basin. This is a stronghold for them, and again, it's due to that cold spring fed system of the Metolius. This is one of the only places where you can catch and keep a bull trout, like this girl's harvested at Lake Billy Chinook. And it's also a strong enough population here that we're able to take a small number of fish and help start a new population, reintroduce bull trout to the Clackamas. So they're doing well. That hasn't always been the case, and bull trout haven't always been beloved. They are a highly piscivorous fish, which means they eat other fish, and in good numbers. They're a very good predator. When we are doing diet studies at Lake Billy Chinook to see how many of our smolts bull trout we're eating, we found as many as 17 kokanee in the belly of one bull trout. So they're a highly effective predator, but they are a part of our native ecosystem and are protected. The next fish species I'm going to talk about are Chinook. Chinook are the biggest of our salmon here. They are considered kind of obligate ocean goers, so they don't have quite as much diversity as the other fish I'm talking about. For the most part, they spawn in the Metolius, also the crooked, and to the lesser extent the Deschutes, but they spawn in freshwater, lay their eggs. The salmon grow up in freshwater for about a year until they undergo the process that lets them tolerate ocean saltwater, which is called smolting. They migrate out to the ocean for a couple of years and come back as adults. And Chinook, again, are one of the species we're trying to reintroduce. And the last species I'm going to introduce you to are kokanee and sockeye. Much like redband and steelhead, these are the same species with different life histories. So I'll start by talking about sockeye because sockeye are the historical population here on the Deschutes. The Subtle Lake is one of 2 lakes in Oregon that historically supported a sockeye run. So historically, sockeye spawned in Link Creek, which is upstream of Subtle Lake. When the sockeye hatched, they would migrate down into Subtle Lake and rear. Sockeye are the only lake rearing salmon species. So they'd spend about a year in Subtle Lake and then migrate down through Lake Creek to the Metolius River. Lake Billy Chinook wasn't there at the time, so they'd go straight into the Deschutes, the Columbia, and the ocean, spend a couple years in the ocean, and then return all the way back to Link Creek to spawn. And so that is the historical state of things. Unfortunately, due to mainly dams on Lake Creek and the Lake Creek Lodge swimming pool, sockeye were pretty depleted as early as the 1940s. And then the Pelton Round Butte project was built, which I'm going to describe a little later, which further blocked sockeye migration up to Subtle Lake and created Lake Billy Chinook, which is another large reservoir. And so with the creation of Lake Billy Chinook, we created a kokanee population. And so kokanee life history today are fish that spawn mainly in the Metolius River, but also its tributaries, migrate to Lake Billy Chinook to grow and rear, and then migrate back to the Metolius River. And then kind of a third complication is with fish passage now, kokanee can turn into sockeye by using fish passage facilities at Lake Billy Chinook, go all the way back to the ocean, go out to the ocean and come back to the Metolius River to spawn. So hopefully I didn't confuse you with all of that. I tend to confuse myself when I try to explain all that, but I'm happy to take questions later if you have them. So with that, really briefly, I'm going to kind of jump into some history, recognizing that I'm ignoring sort of hundreds of years of history and just jumping into, sadly, when we start to see impacts to these salmon populations. On the left, you see a picture there of the Lake Creek Lodge swimming pool that I mentioned earlier. And so that was a big kind of early blocker of sockeye reaching Subtle Lake. There's also a dam built on Subtle Lake in the early 1900s that further kind of blocked the migration of fish into Subtle Lake. And so we are seeing those runs really depleted as early as the 1940s. In the center there, you see an old photo of someone fishing on the Metolius. Fishing was a big kind of impact on Chinook runs in the Metolius. Not so much people fishing within the Metolius itself, but fishing further downstream in the Deschutes. And so the old kind of ODFW records show that the last good Chinook run in the Metolius was in 1953. And after that date, we really didn't see Chinook returning in numbers over the 100 per year. And so we see, despite the fact that we look at the Metolius as being probably our most intact ecosystem in Central Oregon, it still saw some pretty devastating impacts to Chinook and sockeye quite a century ago at this point. And then Pelton Round Butte was constructed. And so I'm going to go into more detail on this piece because this is where I work and this is what I know best. Pelton Round Butte is a 3-dam project on the Deschutes River near Madras. So Pelham Butte was constructed in the 1950s and 1960s. The uppermost dam, Ram Butte Dam, was completed in 1964. Ram Butte Dam creates Lake Billy Chinook that I've mentioned a couple times, and that's a reservoir that's created by the coming together of the Metolius, the Deschutes, and the Crooked Rivers. Currently, Pelham Butte is co-owned by Portland General Electric and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, and it generates enough power to provide power for about 150,000 homes. It's a big hydro project. It's the largest project entirely in the state of Oregon. And just for kind of scale, Ram Butte Dam's about 400 feet tall. So these Ram Butte Dam, the uppermost dam, was constructed in 1964, which just for, I guess, trivia for you all. For those of you who are from Oregon, will kind of recognize that year because it was a huge flood year here throughout Oregon, a big rain on snow event. And that's just interesting because if you know the size of Lake Billy Chinook, they say it filled within 3 days because of the size of that flood. But anyway, it was completed in 1964. It was constructed with fish passage facilities, both juvenile passage facilities and adult passage facilities. Unfortunately, the technology at the time to have successful fish passage facilities, especially juvenile passage, just wasn't there, especially given the complicated nature of Lake Billy Chinook with 3 different rivers coming together. Historically, the outlet at Lake Billy Chinook was at 273 feet, which makes sense if you're generating power. You want to have your water coming off the bottom because that's how you get head pressure and are able to spin those turbines. But it's not good for fish because salmon, steelhead are moving in the top surface waters kind of 30 to 60 feet. And so if you're taking water off the bottom, if that's where your flow is coming from, your fish aren't going to feel that. And so they got lost in the reservoir and never found these original fish passage facilities. So as early as 1972, fish passage was declared a failure at Ram Butte Dam, and we went to hatchery mitigation. And so this is a picture of the construction of Ram Butte Hatchery, which is built right on the dam. And every year we produce a little over 300,000 Chinook and steelhead and release them into the lower Deschutes River to mitigate for the loss of fish in the upper basin. And so that really was the state of things from 1972 on to 2010. In 2005, we received a new FERC license. And so projects like these operate with a license from the Federal Energy Regulating Commission. And those licenses typically last anywhere from 30 to 50 years. And so ours was due to expire in the early 2000s. So about 10 years prior to that, we started doing work to reapply for a new license. And one way that you can apply for a license is to convene all the interested parties within a basin to help you decide what the terms and the conditions will be for your next license. And so that's the route we went. We ended up with 22 settlement parties that all helped kind of shape the rules and the requirements that PGE and the tribes would have to meet in order to continue to operate these dams. And there's a lot there. There's cultural things and terrestrial and water quality, but what we're talking about today are the fish passage pieces. So the main goal out of the license was we needed to work to restore self-sustaining and harvestable runs of Chinook and sockeye and steelhead to the upper Deschutes. And to do that, we needed to restore fish passage at Ram Butte Dam and around all 3 dams. So in 2010, we completed construction of the selective water withdrawal. You also hear it called sort of the tower, the fish tower. And the purpose of this is twofold. One was water temperature management, and the other was fish passage, which is the part I'm focusing on today. And so what this does during the spring is allow us to withdraw water from the surface of Lake Billy Chinook. So you can see those kind of two boxes in the diagram. Those are where the fish can swim into the fish collection system. So gonna kind of take a break and shift gears a little bit from this timeline to sort of my virtual tour of the SWW, since again, our hope was to be able to offer tours with the Land Trust this year to get you guys out actually on the lake to see this, and certainly hope that we can do that in the future, since nothing quite takes the place of actually being there. But this hopefully will help. So this is kind of the beginning of our tour, so to speak. This photo is taken from Round Butte Dam. So that road is standing on the top of Round Butte Dam. If you were to look over to your right, you would be looking down 400 feet of kind of this earthen-filled dam at the Round Butte Hatchery and the powerhouse. On the left, you're seeing Lake Billy Chinook, and then you can see the SWW. So this is looking at the SWW from the access road, and we would walk out that walkway up front into the fish collection entrances. So this is standing out on the fish collection entrances. There's two entrances, so we're looking at, you can see kind of both. They're 40 feet by 60 feet, so they're pretty big size. They are each capable of taking 3,000 CFS of water. So a total of 6,000 CFS, which means the entire Deschutes River under most conditions. And so in the spring, all the water flows through the surface inlet or outlet, I guess. And what happens is it starts to narrow back, and most of the water goes down a flow conduit to the turbines to generate power, and continues on its way through Semtustis and down to the Deschutes. What's left are the fish and a little bit of water. And so everything that goes down to the turbines is screened. So the fish's really only option are to continue to fish, to continue along, or to back out to Lake Billy Chinook. And it gets faster and faster, so that backing out becomes less and less of an option. So the fish end up in this pipe, and they're headed towards our fish processing area. So all the fish are, all the small and medium fish are now in this pipe, and they run through those two boxes. Each of those boxes have pit tag readers. And so that lets us collect information on fish behavior and kind of evaluate the success of our collector. So we're able to put in pit tags in the upper basin, and a pit tag is a microchip that's individually coded that we can implant into a fish and get information. Then when we recapture it on how long it took to make it through Billy Chinook, how much it grew, if it did in fact make it to the SWW. And it's a really cool technology. It's the same thing you may have in your dog at home. It's the exact same technology. These are just much smaller. So the fish then come out of the pipe and they go over these separator bars. And this is really common in fish passage facilities. It's a really simple concept. The big fish slide over the top of the bars and the little fish go through. And why it's important to separate the big fish from the little fish is that the big fish tend to eat the little fish. And so if you keep them in the same raceway for a long period of time, you just end up with a lot of big fat fish. So typically the fish come in during the evening hours, and then in the morning we have a crew of technicians that come and work them up and send them on their way to the lower Deschutes. And so what they do is they crowd up the fish in batches into a bin over here on the side. That gets raised, and the fish and the water along with them goes through this pipe and into this fish processing area. And so this is Kate going through a batch of mostly sockeye and looking at each one to identify if it has any marks. And in the case of Chinook and steelhead, giving them a maxillary clip, which is kind of the jawbone, to indicate they came from the upper deschutes. And this is kind of a unique situation. Most fish passage facilities don't have this much handling, but we are being careful in the deschutes to make sure that we're not introducing disease above the dams that hasn't been there in decades. So that's why we're marking fish, so that only fish that come back with marks that indicate they're from the deschutes get to go back up above the dam. So Kate will sort these, she'll count them, she'll mark them, she'll scan them through that round pit tag detector, and then put them one by one in that tube labeled small, and that sends them outside to eventually get loaded on a truck. Here's Drew, he's doing a very similar thing. He's putting one of those pit tags into a fish. So if you see that little line on his wrist, that's actually a pit tag. So it's a little bigger than a grain of rice. It goes into the belly of the fish, and it lets us identify how many of our fish make it to Bonneville. Everything gets uploaded to a shared database so that we can get information from Bonneville, from estuary, from even some of the bird colonies on the Columbia. We'll find that our fish were consumed there. So it's pretty cool. And then the fish are held in these raceways until evening time, when a second crew comes in and gets ready to haul them around all three dams to the lower deschutes. And so she's removing some netting here that helps keep our birds out. They get loaded into this hopper on a crane along with water, and get loaded into a fish truck with a water-to-water transfer, and then again driven around all three dams and released into the lower deschutes. So this is the release site where they finally get to head out to the ocean, and then this is also the site where they come back, hopefully 2 years later. So that was the tour portion. Again, hopefully we can get a live tour before too long. So that whole process started in 2010. We move a lot of fish, mainly during the springtime, so that most migrations March through June. And we've moved as many as 14,000 smolts to the lower river in one day. That was an extreme day. That's not average by any means, but we do handle a lot of fish through that facility. So in 2012 is when we got our first adults back. So 2010, the first juveniles go downstream. We wait 2 years, and then we start getting our first adults back. And so that's really when I kind of consider reintroduction as starting, because you have the whole life history, the juveniles and the adults. So from 2010 to 2017 is kind of a period that I consider our evaluation period, and it's a little bit of a misnomer because we continue to evaluate, but the focus in those early years was almost exclusively on evaluation and figuring out what was working well with reintroduction, what wasn't, what we needed to change. We tweaked some things and looked if that worked. We measured how many fish were getting to our facility. We found that it's not enough. We aren't where we need to be as far as our license targets in terms of getting fish into the SWW. And similarly, we weren't getting enough adults back. But beyond just kind of noting that we weren't getting where we needed to be, we were starting to understand what things we could do to make real improvements. And so starting in 2017 is when we started doing that. That's when we really kind of started to not just tweak with little things, but make major adaptive management changes to how we're reintroducing fish. And that continues on now. I would say, we started those in 2017 with changing how we generated the project, and we're continuing to make big changes now. And we are continuing to study whether or not those changes are working. So a few examples of this. In the top right, I'm showing that same picture of releasing fish at the lower Deschutes, and you'll notice it's dark out. That's not how we always did things. So when we started reintroduction, we would collect fish in the morning at the SWW, work them up, mark them, put them on a truck, and release them in the lower Deschutes. And we could get that whole process done in a couple hours. And that kind of made sense to us. You know, you don't want to delay their migration any more than you have to. And so we thought that was a good thing. But then we started to notice that when we started to show up with our fish truck and turn up our backup beeper, that the Osprey certainly thought that their food truck had arrived and were keying into the fact that we were about to provide a great food source. And we started to observe that at the SWW, all these fish were coming in at night. And so we thought that it might make more sense to release these fish when they naturally be moving after sunset. And so we tagged fish and released them during the day, and we tagged fish and we released them during the night. And we compared their survival downstream to Trout Creek. And we found that fish that were released during the evening hours survived at a much higher rate than those that were released during the day. And so we've changed our operations to truck fish in the evening. We're not going to stop in there. Our kind of next evolution of this is to hopefully by the spring build a pond down by the lower river so that we can process fish through the SWW, truck them to the lower river, release them in this pond to kind of reduce their stress so that they don't go straight from the truck to the lower river and can volitionally choose to leave on their own when they're kind of ready to hit the river. The bottom picture is not Lake Billy Chinook. That's not the Deschutes, that's Baker. But I've included it because it's showing a guide net. And so this is something you see at most other surface collectors as a way to kind of funnel the fish into the collector. And so that's something we're really actively pursuing right now. It's a really big engineering feat to figure out how to build these given all the loads in a reservoir that's over 200 feet deep, but it's something we're working on because it's shown to be really effective in other places. And then the big kind of most exciting thing to me right now is acclimation. And this has been a really big partnership effort, kind of kicking off this year between Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, PGE, the Land Trust, and the tribes. And this is, I'm kind of showing 3 pictures of different ways to do essentially the same thing. And what we're doing here is holding fish in the water, in the creek water, that we're going to release them in for a couple weeks prior to release. And so what that does is let them kind of get tuned in to the scent of that water so that when they come back as adults, they're more likely to make it to their stream of origin. And we've also found through experimentation that fish that are held in these acclimation pens for a couple weeks are more likely to find their way into the SWW. So that's kind of an added bonus. And so on the far right, you can see this is kind of the most industrial of them. This is also the most efficient. This is at the Deschutes Land Trust property at Camp Polk. This is a big Olympic-sized raceway, essentially a swimming pool, where Vichuse water is pumped in and out, and we can put up to 25,000 fish in it. And so ODFW led this effort. The tank was donated by the tribes for our use, and it worked really, really well. In the center, you see kind of a more low-tech, I guess, version. This is the Camp Sherman Kids Fishing Pond. And so we actually acclimated fish in floating net pens in that pond for a few weeks in the spring. And that was used for Chinook. And then they were released at Spring Creek and in the Metolius. And then on the far left, you see some acclimation pens. Again, low-tech hardware cloth and 2x4s, but it's just getting them kind of keyed in on that Ochoco Creek water. And so that's another kind of partnership with the Land Trust at the Ochoco Preserve. So It's really cool. This works really well in other basins. Some of our pilot studies showed us good results, but the frustrating thing, I guess, about working on these reintroduction projects and studying salmon is we made this big change in 2020, and we sent all these fish to the ocean this year. And so we have to wait 2 years to really know how well it worked, because those fish are kind of out of sight, feeding in the ocean, and we can't really evaluate how successful it was overall for a couple of years. And so that's one of the reasons that reintroduction takes a while, because it, as we're learning and making changes, we have to wait, given these fish are somewhat long-lived. But we continue to be focused on that goal of sustainable and harvestable runs of Chinook and sockeye and steelhead. And we've had some good early indications of success. We also recognize that we can't keep doing things the way we are. So we are making some big changes to hopefully speed up the rate at which we are getting these fish back and getting back to runs where people can fish for them like they used to. So I hope I've gotten you a little excited about salmon in Central Oregon. And now's a good time for this talk, because you have the opportunity, if you're interested, to go out and see kokanee spawning. Every year we have a run of kokanee up the Metolius. As I mentioned, oftentimes there'll be at least 100,000 to 200,000 kokanee that are making their way up the Metolius. So this isn't a small run of fish by any means. We also have 65 sockeye in the system, so by getting to see one of those is an unusual event, but it does happen. Last year when we did the salmon walk, we were able to see a sockeye, so that was pretty cool. Anyway, you guys can go out and see these. It doesn't really take a lot. Now's the time to do it. I would say this week or next week are going to be your best shots, and then they're going to start to kind of dwindle off. They're all over the Metolius. I've listed a few ideas for kind of easy access and pretty good visibility. One of my favorite options is just to go up to Riverside Campground and park there, walk through the campground. You'll hit the Metolius River Trail and then just kind of meander downstream. And that section is really slow, fairly shallow, and it's just easy to see into the water. If you have polarized glasses, those are going to help a lot to be able to cut the glare and see into the water and see these fish. If you don't, you can probably see them anywhere. You might just want to grab like a rimmed hat. And what you're going to do is just look in the shallow areas with gravel. If you're seeing clean gravel, so kind of white patches, those are their reds. And so if you see that clean gravel, kind of look for movement, and those are the fish. And you can see them from the bank without any problem. There really isn't a need to get in the water. If you do decide to be adventurous, one, know that it's very cold, but also please do be mindful that those clean gravel areas are the salmon reds, so you want to avoid stepping in them or immediately in front of them, because you'll end up potentially suffocating the eggs. And the other thing I'd mention, just because I always get this question every time we do the real salmon walk, is that increasingly as we progress, especially in time, the salmon will be dying. So that's part of the natural life cycle, that these fish right now are putting all their energy into reproduction. And so they're very immunocompromised, so they tend to get fungal infections. So you'll see kind of white on a lot of them, and that's perfectly normal to see these fish either dead or pretty close to dead. That's part of the natural cycle of these fish, and nothing to be concerned about. The sooner you head out, the more nice bright red salmon you'll see, and then the further you get into the season, the more you tend to see that later part of the cycle. But that's an odd thing to end on, but I'm going to end there. So I hope that you enjoyed this, and thank you for joining. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Megan, so much. You get me excited, and I'm so glad that this timing worked out. So we were able to connect with folks and encourage everyone to go see them for themselves and before they're all dying. While I give folks online and watching live a chance to add any additional questions into the chat, I wanted to encourage folks to consider making a donation today to support the Land Trust. That link is in the chat. Your support helps us protect amazing places like Camp Polk and Ochako Preserve that you saw, and continuing that work to protect the and do the reintroduction work. So you can make a donation on Facebook or using our website, DeschutesLandTrust.org. But with that, we do have some questions. So Megan, I think the questions, I'm going to try and go in chronological order. So we'll start back at the beginning of just kind of fishy overview questions.
Okay.
So the first one, and this is adding to our fish trivia, and you may not know it, no worries. We have plenty of questions to move on. Which are the largest salmon in the Northwest, and how high can salmon jump? Any answers to those?
Chinook are the largest. And I feel like I should know the answer to the second, but I do not know that off the top of my head. They're good jumpers. And they're definitely good escape artists. So, but I can't give you
perfect. The goal is always to leave with more questions than answers, right? So there's one for folks to research how high they can jump. Then another question related to salmon, kind of talking about the beginning of your presentation. A lot of folks call salmon a keystone species. And could you talk a little bit about what that might mean, or why these efforts are also important?
Yeah, so I think a piece of that is that because salmon go to the ocean, they pick up a lot of nutrients in the ocean environment that we don't necessarily have in our freshwater ecosystems. And so when they come back as adults and they spawn and they die, they deposit those nutrients in our freshwater systems. And those nutrients have been shown to be really beneficial and impact the forests kind of next to streams. And so that I think is a big piece of it. They're also, really important in terms of food source for mammals and other species.
Thank you. Yeah, they really do have so many impacts. I think we'll definitely be sharing a couple of links to articles on the Land Trust website for folks to dig in a little deeper. There's a lot of information that Megan was able to share during this short time, but there is even more. So we'll be sure to share more information. Let's see. I have a question here from Tom. I'm curious about how much did the SWW cost? And I think that's in reference to just construction.
Yeah, so it was $110 million.
That's one you know off the top of your head.
It is. That is one I get almost every time. It's how much it costs. Yeah.
It's a big effort. Absolutely. Then I have a question here from Betsy. She's got a couple of questions. The first is, what are some of the most critical fish passage issues? I do think you touched on some of those, so I'll ask her second question. Betsy is curious how much the handling of the fish stresses them out. She says specifically all the truck driving.
Yeah, so certainly handling has an impact on fish, and your goal is always to reduce handling as much as you can. And I'm less concerned about the truck actually as kind of the marking and the handling processes at the SWW. And we're constantly looking at ways to reduce that. The kind of holding pen I was talking about down at the re-reg, that's a way to reduce stress after trucking fish. We look at how many fish we put in the truck is huge. You want to keep your densities low because that's when they get really stressed out. Making sure we have good oxygenated water. it's a pretty short drive in this case, but certainly making sure we don't have them in the truck any longer than necessary. So there's a lot we can do to reduce handling stress, but anytime you're handling a fish, you are impacting it. And so we're very cognizant of that. And certainly, you know, the long-term vision of reintroduction at Pelton Rambutte is to move to a volitional system. But that's out there a ways. We have to kind of get to that more sustainable harvestable runs before we start down the volitional path. But that's in the license, and that is kind of our ultimate goal.
Thanks. I know we could talk about all of these things for a while, but the questions keep coming, so I'll move you on.
All right, sounds good.
Laura here has a question about the percentage of fish lost, either during the handling or moving process. I think that's not necessarily percentage of fish return. Does that make sense?
Maybe I'll answer it
Sure.
the way I interpret it, and hopefully it is, and if not, let us know. But you know, one of the things we measure is mortality through the system as well as injury through the system, and we have a requirement that we maintain kind of survival through the system at least 96%. And so we've been on average about 98% survival. So I guess I'm interpreting loss to mean death in this case. You know, it's about 2% or less that we have lost in the SWW. Everything's screened, so we don't have any loss to where fish are going through turbines or that kind of thing. And we don't spill, so we don't have fish going over a spillway around Butte. So we don't see kind of loss in those ways that you might see it at other dams.
Thanks, Laura. Hopefully that answered your question. I think I'll jump us to a different question about the SWW and the fish that are collected there. It looks like a question about maybe other fish that are collected. So Tom is asking about lake dwelling fish, bass, crappie, and stickleback, and wondering if those were transferred into the Deschutes or released into the lake, or what happens if you catch a fish you don't want?
All of that. So we catch pretty much anything that's in Billy Chinook. And for the non-migratory fish, so kind of your bass and that kind of thing, for the most part, they're recycled back into Lake Billy Chinook. There's some species that are considered invasive and not game species, and those are euthanized. So an example would be like the bullhead catfish. We do euthanize those rather than pass them back into the lake where they could eat our native fish. And so that's one example. Bull trout, some of those are recycled back into the lake. Some of them go to the lower Deschutes, depending on size. Probably the most interesting fish we've caught was a 4-foot long sturgeon. And sturgeon shouldn't be here. They're in the Columbia, but they aren't really native to the Deschutes. So there's a little bit of question of how it got here. What we did with that fish, and we've actually caught 2, is pit tag it and release it downstream of Shears Falls into the lower Deschutes where sturgeon should be. But that was definitely a surprise to come in there one morning and see this like huge shadow when you typically only see, you know, much smaller fish.
Yeah, that would definitely be a surprise. Thanks, Megan. I can only imagine some of those strange things that have popped up.
Let's talk about them all.
Yeah. Tim has another question. It looks like a question about the data and the research being done. You know, this is an adaptive, ongoing, evolving process, trying to figure out what's working. And they're asking, do you collect information only on the fish that return? It sounds like that's the return data.
So we collect fish on the juveniles moving downstream. And so, you know, we have information on what % of those enter the SWW. We tag fish and look at their behavior out in front of the SWW. We just completed a study with cameras out in front of the SWW, like fancy fish finders, to look at how fish were behaving right out in front. So we're collecting a lot of information on juveniles, and then we're also collecting information on adults. So we don't really have any information on that period where they're in the ocean. We don't do any research there, and so that's kind of a big black box. But when fish come back as adults, we give many of them a radio tag so that we can detect where they're going in the upper basin to spawn, and hopefully document them successfully finding a mate and spawning. So we do research on both kind of ends of the spectrum.
Super. I've got 2 more questions, so I think we'll try and roll through those and then finish up. Betsy asks, are there opportunities for upstream fish ladders for the adults that are returning?
So currently, no. Currently, we are trucking fish. Historically, it was the longest ladder in the world at the time. So there was a ladder that's still in existence. It's currently being used to rear Chinook, not past Chinook, but there's a ladder that goes from the lowest most dam, the re-regulating dam, up to Lake Semtestus. And historically, they would pass up that ladder, go into Semtestus, swim through that middle reservoir, and then they would like enter a trap where they would be put into a, I don't know, I call it a gondola, and raised 400 feet over the top of Round Butte Dam, and then lowered into Lake Billy Chinook. And so that was the historic kind of version of, I guess, a ladder at Round Butte. A ladder, and that worked, probably not by today's standards, but, you know, I think we, again, volitional is the ultimate goal, so we would be down the road looking at different versions for that. A ladder to get around all 3 dams would be really challenging, just given the height. Pelton's 200 some feet and Round Butte's 400 feet, and so you'd need a really long ladder. So you'd probably be looking at other options for adult passage volitionally.
Excellent. That would be a long ladder, definitely.
Yeah.
I will roll us into our last question. I know there are a couple more that are coming in, but we are running shorter on time. So we will take in all of your questions and find some resources to help you answer them that we'll share out at the end. So for our last question, Paul is asking, has the SWW increased water temperature and quality in the lower Deschutes River Basin?
So it's really a hard question to answer quickly. What the SWW kind of attempts to do is return water temperature patterns to what they would be like if the dams and the reservoirs weren't here. And so what that means is that water temperatures during the springtime are warmer, and during the fall time are cooler. And so it has changed for sure kind of how water temperature is in the lower Deschutes, but it isn't just sort of warming up the water. It's trying to restore more natural temperature regime to the lower Deschutes.
Thanks so much. I know we've tossed a lot of questions at you that are part of complex systems and are not in isolation, but thanks so much for answering. I think we'll wrap that up with that one. Megan, do you have any last things you'd like to share with folks before they head out?
I don't think so. Just thank you for being here. And yeah, I hope that we can do an in-person event next year and be on the, the side of the stream instead of in my spare bedroom.
I hope so too, and I really look forward to it. Being up on visiting the tower, I'm sure is going to be a different experience than logging into Zoom. So thanks, Megan, again for all your time, and thank you everyone else for being here. I know I learned quite a lot, and I hope you did too. We sure hope you'll tune in to join us for something else in the future, or even like we mentioned, a tour in person in the spring or next fall. If you're interested in learning more about nature of Central Oregon, you can subscribe to our newsletter at DeschutesLandTrust.com and learn all about all of the wonderful things that are Central Oregon. So thank you so much. Again, you can make a donation at DeschutesLandTrust.org/support. We hope we'll see you again sometime soon. And good luck out there looking for those fish. Let us know if you find any, if you go out to see them along the Metolius. Have a great evening, everyone. Thanks again.